Ever wondered how hackers could infiltrate an ongoing network session without your knowledge? It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Well, there's a name for this, and it's called a session attack. Session attacks are a popular method used by hackers to exploit vulnerabilities in network security. The basic concept revolves around network sessions. These are like conversations between two devices over a network. When you log into a website or your email, you're initiating a network session. Now imagine if someone could eavesdrop on your conversation or even take your place without you knowing. That's essentially what a session attack is, an intrusion into these network conversations. And this is why maintaining session integrity is vital in cybersecurity. It's about ensuring that the conversation remains private and secure, and the participants are who they claim to be. But how do these session attacks happen? There are three main types that you should be aware of. The first one is session hijacking. This is when an attacker takes over a session between two devices. They can do this by stealing the session ID, which is like a pass for the conversation. The second type is session sidejacking. In this case, the attacker doesn't take over the session. Instead, they copy the session ID and use it to create a parallel session. It's like they've cloned your pass and are now having a separate conversation pretending to be you. And finally, we have session replay attacks. This is when the attacker intercepts and records the session data to replay it later. It's like recording a conversation and then playing it back to fool the system into thinking it's a new conversation. Now that you understand what a session attack is, how exactly does it occur? Well, that's a question for our next scene. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to appreciate the intrigue and sophistication of these attacks. After all, understanding the enemy is the first step in defending against them. Imagine being in a conversation, then someone else jumps in and takes your place without the other party noticing. That's a session attack. Now let's break down the mechanics of a session attack. It begins with a hacker intercepting network communications. This can be achieved through various means, such as eavesdropping on unsecured Wi-Fi networks or through malware. Once in, the attacker can manipulate or steal data, effectively gaining control of the session. Picture this. You're in a bustling cafe, sipping your coffee and browsing the internet. Unbeknownst to you, a hacker sitting at the next table has slipped into your network conversation. This is known as session hijacking. Here, the attacker takes over a session between two machines, effectively becoming you in the eyes of the server. They can now perform actions as if they were you, and you're none the wiser. Next, we have session sidejacking. This is where the attacker makes a copy of the session to use later. Imagine someone secretly recording your conversation, then using that recording to mimic you in future interactions. That's session sidejacking. The attacker doesn't need to take over the session immediately. Instead, they store the session data for future use. Lastly, we have session replay attacks. This is where an attacker intercepts and replays transmission. Think of it as watching a rerun of a TV show. The attacker captures the data, then replays it to the server. This can lead to unauthorized transactions or data theft, as the server believes the replayed transmission is legitimate. In all these cases, the common thread is that the attacker is inserting themselves into a session, pretending to be a legitimate user. This can lead to massive data breaches, financial losses, and even compromised personal security. Seems complex, doesn't it? But what are the key points to remember about session attacks? Session attacks are a serious threat, but understanding them is the first step towards prevention. Let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far. Session attacks are a malicious technique used by cybercriminals to exploit the communication between a client and a server. By doing so, they can gain unauthorized access, steal data, or even lay the groundwork for more extensive attacks. We've delved into the three main types of session attacks. Firstly, we have session hijacking, where an attacker intercepts and takes over a session between two systems. It's like a game of musical chairs, where the attacker slips into your seat when you're not looking. Then there's session sidejacking, a more subtle method where the attacker sniffs out packets of data being transferred within a session. This is akin to eavesdropping on a conversation, picking up bits and pieces of information without being detected. Lastly, we discussed session replay attacks. Here, the attacker intercepts data, but instead of simply listening in, they record the information to replay it later. It's like recording a concert to watch again at home, except in this case, the concert could be your sensitive data and the home is the attacker's lair. It's important to grasp the potential impact these attacks can have. Data theft is a common outcome, which could mean the loss of personal or business information. Unauthorized access is another risk. With this, the attacker could manipulate your system, alter data, or even launch further attacks. These session attacks can be the starting point for a domino effect of cyber threats, each one potentially more damaging than the last. It's not just about the immediate impact, but the potential for long-term damage and disruption. So, understanding session attacks is not just about knowing what they are, but recognizing their potential implications and how they function. This knowledge is your first line of defense in the ever-evolving landscape of cyber threats. Never underestimate the power of knowledge in the fight against cyber threats. Knowledge is power, and in this context, it's your best defense against session attacks. To protect your digital fortress from these intrusions, several strategies can be employed. First, always ensure you're using secure network connections. This means avoiding public Wi-Fi when handling sensitive data and opting for virtual private networks or encrypted connections whenever possible. Second, keep your software up to date. Updates often contain crucial security patches that fix vulnerabilities which hackers may exploit. Regularly updating your software is like reinforcing the walls of your fortress. Third, implement strong authentication protocols. Two-factor authentication, complex passwords, and biometric authentication are all effective ways to secure your sessions. Finally, always be aware of the latest threats and trends in cybersecurity. Just as the tactics of attackers evolve, so too should your defenses. Remember, in the realm of cybersecurity, staying informed and vigilant is your best line of defense.